At -50 degrees, your lungs do not freeze slowly. They explode from the inside out the moment you inhale air cold enough to turn human blood into slush in 90 seconds. On the northern Mongolian steppe in the late autumn of 1944, the atmosphere did not merely turn cold. It transformed into an active, predatory force. When an Arctic high-pressure front drops down from the Siberian wilderness across this plateau, there is no polite transition between autumn and winter. The sky hardens into a bleak, crystalline blue, the wind sharpens into a blade, and the temperature drops 40 degrees in a single afternoon. If you stand out on the open grass when that wind hits, every breath feels like swallowing pulverized glass. Your nostrils freeze shut on the intake, your eyelashes lock together in frost, and the moisture on your tongue solidifies before you can finish speaking a sentence. What makes this environment terrifying is not just the temperature, but the sheer, naked vulnerability of the landscape itself. The Mongolian steppe is a vast, rolling ocean of grass, larger than the entire continent of Western Europe. Across millions of square kilometers, there are no dense pine forests to harvest for timber. There are no deep mountain caves to shelter inside. There are no rock walls to hide behind, and no natural windbreaks to disrupt a gale that has gathered momentum across 2,000 miles of open tundra. It is just grass, sky, and a cold that has been killing living creatures since long before human beings ever learned to walk on two legs. If you were dropped onto this frozen plateau in the middle of November with a modern toolbox, a pile of lumber, and a modern furnace, you would likely be dead within 72 hours. Standard construction relies on a steady supply of dense fuel, heavy framing, and rigid foundations. But on the steppe, there were no lumber yards, no hardware stores, and no forest to cut down for firewood. Yet, for more than 3,000 years, nomadic families did not just survive on this frozen plain, they thrived. They raised newborn infants in the dead of January. They kept fragile livestock alive through storms that would shatter steel equipment. They built a mobile, thriving civilization in an environment that every major empire in history written in stone considered completely uninhabitable. They did it without cutting down a single tree for firewood. They did it without building stone fortresses or digging underground bunkers. And they did it using a portable, organic shelter made entirely of sheep's wool, bent willow branches, and dried animal waste that could be packed onto the back of 3 camels, moved 30 miles across a blizzard, and reassembled in less than an hour before nightfall. How was this possible? How did an ancient nomadic culture master thermodynamics so completely that their simple felt homes maintained a comfortable 64 degrees Fahrenheit inside, while a lethal -52 degrees screamed across the plain outside? To answer that, you have to understand a forgotten science, a way of building that did not fight the physics of extreme cold, but instead turned those very laws of physics into an ally. Before we dive into the mind-blowing mechanics of how this worked, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from today. Your support helps us bring these incredible forgotten survival stories back to life. Now, let us look at the story of one old master herder who proved to the world that ancient wisdom could defeat the deadliest winter the northern steppe had seen in half a century. Old Jargal stood at the edge of his family's autumn camp, his hands tucked deep into the sleeves of his heavy sheepskin coat, watching the horizon. At 62 years old, Jargal's skin was as dark and weathered as aged leather, lined by 6 decades of squinting across the blinding white snow of the northern plateau. He was a master herder, a man who could tell you that a blizzard was 3 days away simply by tasting the salt in the morning breeze or watching the way his yaks clustered against a dry riverbed. Jargal did not read books, but he understood the physics of heat, wind, and fiber better than almost any university professor in Asia. Beside him stood a young man who represented a very different world. Inspector Victor was 24 years old, dressed in a stiff, government-issued wool overcoat with polished brass buttons, holding a metal clipboard in his gloved hands. Victor was a fresh graduate from the Regional Agricultural Institute in Ulaanbaatar, sent north by the Central Planning Committee to enforce a sweeping new state mandate. The government had decided that the traditional nomadic way of life was an outdated relic of the past. To modernize the region, the state was constructing centralized wooden plank collective barracks and animal sheds across the district. "You are being stubborn, Jargal," Victor said, his voice sharp with the confidence of a young man holding an official government decree. "The state has allocated 3,000 meters of milled timber for this district. We are building solid, rectangular wooden barracks with iron stoves and tin chimneys. Real buildings. Civilized buildings. The families who move into the collective settlement will have real roofs over their heads. This traditional felt tent of yours is primitive. It is dirty, it is weak, and it is a health hazard." Jargal did not raise his voice. He did not look at the clipboard. Instead, he pointed his long wooden pipe toward a pile of fresh timber planks that state trucks had dumped near the riverbank a week earlier. "Look at your wood, young man," Jargal said quietly, his voice carrying the deep, resonant gravel of the high mountains. "The air is only 15 below today, and already those boards are bowing and cracking. You brought timber cut from green trees in the southern valleys. In 2 weeks, when the true cold from the north descends, those iron nails you hammered into those planks will shrink faster than the wood. They will turn as brittle as glass and snap in two. The wind will find the seams between your straight boards, and it will strip the heat out of your wooden box 15 times faster than your stove can make it." Victor let out an impatient sigh, tapping his clipboard. "We have wood-burning iron stoves coming from the central depot. We have coal shipments scheduled." "Where is the wood?" Jargal asked, turning his dark eyes directly onto the young inspector. "Look around you, Victor. We are on the northern steppe. There is not a tree for 200 kilometers in any direction. When your trucks get stuck in the first snowdrift, where will you find wood to burn in those iron stoves? Will your families burn their own furniture when the wind turns to a gale? Will you feed your plank walls to the fire when the temperature hits 50 below?" Victor flushed, his pride wounded by the old herder's logic. "The state schedule is fixed, Jargal. The collective barracks are the future. Those who refuse to move their herds to the timber shelters will be noted as saboteurs. When the winter storms hit this January, your flimsy wool tent will be flattened by the wind, and your livestock will freeze where they stand. I will return in January for the official district audit. If your herd is dead and your family is freezing, the state will confiscate your remaining stock and absorb your land." Old Jargal turned back to the horizon, where the first gray clouds of the Siberian front were beginning to pile against the sky. "Bring your thermometer when you return, Inspector," the old man said softly. "Bring it, and we will see whose house is a grave and whose house is a home." Long before a single wooden pole was unstacked or a single felt panel was unrolled, the most critical decision of winter survival had already been made. To an outsider, the Mongolian steppe looks completely uniform, a flat, featureless plain of brown grass stretching infinitely toward the horizon. But to old Jargal, the ground was a complex landscape written in a subtle language of slopes, depressions, and thermal currents. Jargal spent 3 days selecting his winter camp, a site known in the Mongolian language as the Over. He did not choose the site based on convenience, proximity to the main trail, or arbitrary land boundaries. He chose it based on the microtopography of the earth. He selected a gentle, bowl-shaped depression situated on the lower third of a south-facing hillside slope. This location was a masterclass in natural thermodynamic placement, a principle the old herders called Ulan Suder, literally, finding the shadow of the mountain. The physics behind this choice were remarkably precise. The prevailing winter winds in northern Asia do not blow randomly. They sweep down from the Arctic Circle in a relentless northwest to southeast vector. When these heavy, sub-zero air masses strike an elevated ridge or hill, they do not wrap around it. They are forced upward, launching over the crest of the hill like water flowing over a dam. By positioning his camp on the lower southern slope of the ridge, Jargal placed his home in a permanent dead-air envelope. The brutal 60-mile-an-hour gale passed directly overhead, roaring through the sky 50 feet above the camp, while the air at ground level remained almost perfectly still. Furthermore, by choosing a south-facing slope angled at approximately 12 degrees, Jargal maximized the absorption of winter solar radiation. In December and January, at 50 degrees north latitude, the sun sits extremely low on the horizon, casting weak, pale light across the landscape. When that light hits flat, level ground, it glances off at a shallow angle, reflecting most of its thermal energy back into the atmosphere. But when it strikes a 12-degree southern slope, the sunlight hits the ground at a much more direct angle. That small topographic tilt was enough to raise the surface temperature of the soil by as much as 8 to 10 degrees Celsius compared to the flat plain just 1 kilometer away. Water placement required an equally delicate balance. Jargal needed to be within reach of a water source, but building his camp directly in a river valley was a fatal mistake that inexperienced herders often made. River valleys act as natural wind tunnels, funneling icy drafts along the waterline and creating localized cold sinks where dense, freezing air collects at night. Jargal chose a spot 800 meters away from a frozen tributary close enough that his daughter Naran could haul blocks of river ice to the camp on a wooden sled, but high enough above the valley floor to stay well above the stagnant pool of night cold. Once the precise location was chosen, Jargal and Naran began preparing the ground. They did not simply set their shelter on top of the frozen grass. Using heavy iron picks, they leveled a circular earth pad 16 feet in diameter. They dug down 6 inches through the topsoil until they reached a dense layer of dry, compacted yellow clay. Over this clay base, Jargal spread a 4-inch subfloor layer consisting of crushed river gravel mixed with dry, harvested pine needles that he had hauled from the southern foothills late that summer. This gravel and needle base served as a vital capillary break. When the heat from inside the home eventually warmed the earth beneath it, any ground moisture or frost trapped in the upper soil would be prevented from rising upward into the living space. The gravel allowed water vapor to drain downward, while the resin-rich pine needles acted as a natural, rot-resistant layer of ground insulation. While the state planners in the district town were pouring thin, uninsulated concrete slabs for their wooden barracks slabs that would act as massive cold bridges, sucking heat directly out of any building anchored to them, old Jargal was building a foundation that used the Earth's natural thermal inertia to lock out the frost before a single wall was ever raised. With the site prepared, the focus turned to the primary insulating material of the nomadic home, felt. To a modern observer, accustomed to synthetic fiberglass or foam insulation, sheep's wool might seem like a simple, traditional fabric. But when processed correctly, wool felt is one of the most effective, dynamic, insulating materials ever discovered. Wool is not a flat fiber. Under a microscope, every single strand of sheep's wool is covered in thousands of tiny, overlapping directional scales, much like the scales on a fish. When raw wool is exposed to water, warmth, and intense physical pressure, these microscopic scales open up, hook into one another, and interlock so tightly that they can never be pulled apart. The result is felt a dense, non-woven mat of pure animal fiber, filled with millions of microscopic, trapped dead air pockets. In late September, long before the first frost, Jargal, Naran, and several neighboring families gathered to manufacture the winter felt panels. The process was a grueling physical ordeal that required the strength of the entire community. First, hundreds of pounds of spring-shorn wool were spread out across flat canvas sheets. The wool was beaten with long willow switches for hours to loosen dirt, remove coarse guard hairs, and fluff the fibers into a uniform cloud. Next, warm water mixed with sour milk whey was sprayed evenly over the wool layer. The acid in the whey helped open the microscopic scales on the wool fibers, preparing them to bind. Then came the extraordinary part of the process. The wet wool was rolled tightly around a heavy, 6-inch thick wooden log, forming a dense cylinder 4 meters long and nearly 3 feet in diameter. This massive roll was wrapped in thick, greased raw ox hides and lashed securely with heavy rawhide ropes. 2 young men mounted powerful steppe horses, attaching long rawhide tow lines from their saddles to the ends of the wooden log. At a signal from Jargal, the riders kicked their horses into a full, pounding gallop across 15 kilometers of rough, open plain. The heavy leather cylinder dragged behind the horses, bouncing, rolling, and slamming against the hard ground at 30 miles an hour. For nearly 2 hours, the horses maintained the pace, dragging the cylinder back and forth across the plateau. The violent, continuous pounding compressed the wet wool fibers with incredible force, driving out every excess drop of water and forcing the microscopic scales on millions of wool strands to lock together into an impenetrable, unified structure. When the horses finally pulled the roll back into the camp and the leather bindings were unlashed, the result was a sheet of white felt 4 meters wide, 8 meters long, and nearly 3/4 of an inch thick. It was so dense that a sharp knife could barely cut through it, yet so flexible it could be folded like a blanket. For his main winter home, the Jargal had manufactured 12 distinct layers of this heavy felt. When wrapped over the wooden frame of the shelter, these 12 layers created a continuous, windproof insulation envelope over 6 inches thick. It was an envelope that contained no chemical adhesives, no metal fasteners, and no synthetic materials, yet provided a thermal resistance value that rivaled modern commercial insulation made entirely from the byproduct of grass, water, and horsepower. With the felt sheets curing in the autumn sun, Jargal turned his attention to the structural skeleton of the gers. The wooden frame of a Mongolian gers is an engineering marvel designed around a simple, profound principle: structural load distribution through flexible scissor geometry. The outer walls of the gers consist of several expandable lattice fence sections known as the khana. Each khana is made from dozens of thin, hand-planed slats of flexible steppe willow. These slats are crossed in a diagonal diamond pattern and pinned together at every intersection. What makes the khana brilliant is that it does not use a single rigid nail, screw, or iron bracket. Instead, every single pivot point in the lattice grid is pinned using a short strip of raw camel hide. Jargal prepared these hide pins using a method his grandfather had taught him. Fresh, untanned camel rawhide was cut into thin, narrow strips and soaked in warm water until it became soft and pliable. Jargal pushed the wet hide strip through small holes drilled at the wooden intersections, knotted both ends tightly, and allowed the hide to dry in the cool air. As camel rawhide dries, it undergoes extreme linear shrinkage, contracting with tremendous force and hardening into an unbreakable, stone-like rivet. This choice of material was not a matter of primitive limitation. It was a matter of high-level, cold-weather engineering. At -50 degrees, iron brackets and steel bolts suffer from severe cold brittleness. When exposed to extreme thermal shock and hurricane-force wind vibration, metal fasteners crystallize and snap cleanly in two. Furthermore, metal acts as a thermal bridge, conducting heat straight out of the interior and creating localized cold spots where frost accumulates. Raw camel hide, on the other hand, retains its structural elasticity even in the deepest sub-zero cold. When a 60-knot gale slams against the side of the gers, the lattice walls do not stand rigid and snap under the stress. The entire frame flexes slightly, absorbing the kinetic energy of the wind across hundreds of flexible hide-pin joints, distributing the load evenly throughout the entire structure before springing back into its original shape. Above the lattice walls sits the roof, a series of 80-long straight willow poles called the uni, which radiate inward like the spokes of a bicycle wheel toward a central circular crown ring at the apex called the tonneau. The structural physics of this roof configuration are breathtaking. When heavy snow accumulates on the conical roof of the gers, the downward weight presses on the roof poles, forcing them outward at the top of the lattice wall. To counteract this outward thrust, Jargal wrapped 3 thick, hand-woven horsehair ropes the surge around the upper perimeter of the lattice walls. This created a continuous, self-tightening, structural loop. The heavier the snow fell on the roof, the greater the outward push of the roof poles became, which in turn increased the tension on the horsehair bands around the perimeter, clamping the lattice walls even more tightly inward. The storm load itself was converted into structural stability. The harsher the weather raged outside, the tighter and stronger the gers locked together. In mid-December, 2 weeks before the great winter freeze was expected to hit, old Jargal made his final trip into the district trading station to secure salt, tea, and iron cooking pots. The trading post was a scene of frantic, chaotic activity. Dozens of herders who had surrendered to government pressure were working under the direction of Inspector Victor, trying desperately to finish the state's modern timber plank collective barracks before the weather broke. The site was a mess of sawdust, frozen mud, and shouting men. Workers were hammering iron nails into frosted planks, their fingers bleeding in the bitter cold, while trucks sputtered and stalled as their diesel fuel turned to thick gel in the dropping temperatures. When Jargal pulled his horse up near the main supply shed, several of the younger herders who had joined the collective stopped working and pointed at his pack saddles. "Look at old Jargal!" one young man shouted, laughing loudly to the crowd. "He has come to the depot, but he isn't loading any wood. Where is your firewood, old man? Do you think your wool tent will keep you warm on warm thoughts alone?" Inspector Victor stepped out of the construction office, his clipboard tucked under his arm, a smug smile on his face. He walked over to Jargal's horse, looking at the empty pack frames. "You are out of time, Jargal," Victor said, his voice carrying across the busy yard. "The weather reports from the northern stations are terrible. A massive cold front is moving down from Siberia tonight. Temperatures will drop past 40 below by weekend. Look at these families here. They have stacked 5 cords of dry pine behind the collective barracks. They have iron stoves installed in every timber unit. What do you have?" Jargal slowly dismounted, his movements unhurried, his expression completely unreadable. He looked at the massive pile of pine logs behind the wooden barracks, then looked at the thin smoke rising from the barracks' tin chimneys. "I have what the steppe provides, Inspector," Jargal said quietly. "I have Argal." A wave of laughter erupted from the collective workers. Argal was the nomadic word for dried animal manure specifically, the compressed manure harvested from winter sheep and cattle pens. "You plan to heat a tent at 40 below by burning animal dung?" Victor asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "That is dirty, backward, and ridiculous. Manure smolders. It produces smoke, not real heat. Wood burns at high temperatures. Manure is just waste." Jargal stepped closer to Victor, his deep voice cutting through the wind. "Green pine wood is 40% water, young man. When you burn it in your iron stove, half the energy of your fire goes into boiling that water into steam before the wood can even create heat. That steam rises up your thin tin chimney, meets the freezing air outside, and turns into thick creosote that clogs your flue. Dried dung from the winter pen is different. It has been trampled for months by the hooves of 1,000 sheep. The animals have stamped out every bubble of air, compressing the grass fiber into dense, hard blocks. When we dry those blocks in the summer sun, they become as hard as wood and as dry as bone. They contain no water. They burn with a slow, intense, smoldering heat that lasts 3 times longer than your soft pine planks, producing a bed of glowing coals that holds its heat all night long. Keep your wood, Inspector. Keep your nails and your cracked boards. But remember your promise. When the storm passes, bring your thermometer to my camp. If my herd is dead, you can take my land. But if my house is warm and my animals are alive, you will write in your official report that the wisdom of the steppe is greater than the wisdom of your city textbooks." Victor's smile vanished. He stared at the old herder for a long moment, then scribbled something sharply on his clipboard. "The audit stands. Jargal. January 15th. Be ready." The winter of 1945 did not enter Mongolia as a simple cold snap. It arrived as a dzud, the catastrophic, multi-layered winter disaster that nomadic cultures have feared since the dawn of time. A dzud occurs when several distinct extreme weather phenomena converge simultaneously. On the night of January 8th, the barometric pressure across northern Mongolia plummeted to levels rarely recorded in modern meteorology. The temperature did not decline gradually over days. It dropped like a stone falling off a cliff. By midnight, it hit -35 degrees Celsius. By dawn, -48. By the following evening, the mercury in official liquid thermometers locked solid at the bottom of its glass tube, indicating a temperature past -52 degrees Celsius, more than 60 degrees below zero in Fahrenheit. Along with the killing temperature came the wind, a sustained 55-knot Arctic gale that picked up the loose, dry snow from the Siberian tundra and drove it horizontally across the flat plain. Visibility dropped to less than 2 meters. Worse still, this storm represented the deadly convergence of three distinct types of disaster: the Sagan Zud, or White Death, where deep snow buries all pasture grass beneath an impassable drift; the Lud Zud, or Cold Death, where extreme temperatures drain the caloric reserves of living creatures at a terrifying rate; and the most dreaded of all, the Jvarn Zud, or Iron Death. The Iron Death happens when a brief, deceptive thaw melts the top layer of snow, immediately followed by a sudden plunge in temperature that encases the entire landscape under a 2-inch shell of solid, glass-like ice. Under an Iron Zud, livestock cannot reach the grass beneath the ice. Their hooves bleed as they try to break through the frozen crust. If they cannot reach feed, they starve to death standing up, their stomach contents frozen solid while the howling wind strips the remaining heat from their bodies. While the storm raged across the open plateau, old Jargal was executing a layout strategy that had been refined over 1,000 years: the Kur compound formation. Jargal had not set his family's ger up as an isolated structure. He had arranged 4 gers: his own main living ger, his daughter's smaller family ger, a storage ger, and a specialized shelter in a tight, interlocking circular ring facing south. The space between the 4 circular structures was separated by less than 2 meters, forming a protected, enclosed inner courtyard in the center of the compound. The entrance doors of all 4 gers opened inward toward this central courtyard, completely sheltered from the howling gale outside. As the storm hit its peak on the second night, Jargal and Naran drove their entire herd, 120 sheep, goats, and young yaks, directly into this central courtyard ring. The result was an extraordinary example of biological windbreak engineering. Packed tightly together inside the wind-protected courtyard, the animals formed a dense, living mass of bodies. The sheep and goats naturally snuggled together, their thick wool coats interlocking to create a barrier that blocked the wind from scouring the ground-level seams of the gers. Furthermore, 100 large animals generate an immense amount of metabolic body heat. Resting together in the wind-blocked courtyard, the herd's collective body heat raised the ambient temperature of the inner courtyard air by nearly 8 degrees Celsius above the surrounding storm temperature. The animals protected the base of the homes from the wind. The homes protected the animals from the freezing gale. The heat from the humans inside the gers leaked slightly into the courtyard, while the heat from the animals warmed the air surrounding the inner doors of the homes. It was a completely self-sustaining, closed-loop thermal ecosystem, where every living body contributed to the survival of the whole. 16 kilometers to the east, at the District Collective Station, the state's modern timber barracks were experiencing a catastrophic, multi-system collapse. Inspector Victor and 30 families who had been persuaded to move into the new wooden collective buildings were trapped inside what was rapidly becoming a frozen wooden tomb. The structural and thermal flaws that old Jargal had predicted were playing out with terrifying precision. The first failure was dimensional and geometric. The state barracks had been designed like standard European buildings, rectangular structures with 10-foot-high flat ceilings and right-angled corners. In a warm climate, high ceilings are pleasant. At minus 50 degrees, they are fatal. As the iron stoves inside the barracks burned, the warm air produced by the fires naturally rose straight to the peak of the 10-foot ceiling, pooling uselessly overhead where no human being could reach it. Down at floor level, where families sat and slept, the air remained near freezing. Worse still, the right-angled corners of the rectangular rooms created severe convective dead zones. The air in the 4 corners of every room stagnated, cooled rapidly against the cold timber walls, and sank to the floor, creating continuous, rolling drafts that swept across the floorboards from the corners toward the center of the room. The second failure was material and atmospheric. The green pine planks that had been nailed together during the autumn had contracted violently as the sub-zero cold stripped every drop of ambient moisture out of the wood. The timber shrunk, pulling away from the iron nails. Millions of microscopic seams opened up between the wallboards. The 55-knot wind outside hit these split seams and created a powerful suction effect. Cold air was pulled through the cracks on the windward side, while warm air was violently sucked out through the seams on the leeward side. The convective wind shear was so intense that it stripped heat out of the interior rooms 15 times faster than the iron stoves could produce it. Inside the rooms, a nightmare scenario unfolded. The moisture from the breath of dozens of shivering people and the steam from their cooking pots had nowhere to go. It hit the freezing wooden walls and instantly condensed, turning into a thick, solid layer of white frost that coated the interior boards. Within 48 hours, the inside of the barracks looked like the interior of an ice cave. This ice layer acted as a continuous, active cold sink, drawing whatever small amount of warmth remained in the room and radiating cold directly back at the occupants. Then came the fuel catastrophe. The iron stoves, pushed to their absolute limits by desperate families trying to warm the freezing rooms, devoured firewood at an unprecedented rate. The collective burned through 2 cords of wood in 48 hours. By the 3rd day of the storm, the wood pile behind the barracks was completely exhausted. Families began burning wooden crates, then tool handles, and finally the very interior partition doors of the barracks itself. To make matters worse, several tin stovepipes, exposed to extreme heat on the inside and -50 on the outside, suffered severe thermal shock. The metal cracked along its welded seams. Acrid, choking black smoke poured back into the overcrowded rooms, forcing the families to crack open the main doors to vent the smoke, allowing the killing sub-zero wind to sweep straight inside. In the uninsulated wooden animal sheds next door, the situation was even grim. Lacking body heat management or proper windbreak geometry, the thin timber walls offered virtually no protection against the wind chill. By the 4th morning of the storm, 35% of the collective's cattle and sheep had succumbed to cold stress and pneumonia, their frozen carcasses stiffening in the dark, drafty stalls. Inspector Victor sat huddled in the corner of the main office room, wrapped in 3 coats, his hands so numb he could no longer hold his pencil, watching the frost creep steadily across the floorboards toward his boots. The modern promise of timber and steel had failed completely. While the state barracks bled heat and fuel, inside old Jargal's manger, 3 generations of his family were living in a microclimate that defied every assumption of modern engineering. To step through the low, south-facing door of Jargal's ger during the height of the -50-degree storm was to step into a completely different world. The air inside was not merely bearable, it was genuinely, delightfully warm, holding steady at 18 degrees Celsius, 64 degrees Fahrenheit, from floor to ceiling. This extraordinary environment was sustained by a brilliant combination of natural chemistry, self-regulating ventilation, and continuous thermal mass. The first secret lay in the walls themselves, a phenomenon modern building scientists call the exothermic moisture reaction of hygroscopic fiber. Inside the ger, the air was naturally filled with humidity, generated by the breath of 7 family members, the steam from boiling tea, and the warm soup simmering on the central burner. In a modern metal or wooden building, this humidity is a dangerous enemy that creates frost and rot. But in a wool-felt home, humidity is an active fuel source. Wool is one of the most hygroscopic natural fibers on Earth. As the relative humidity inside the ger rose, the dense, dry wool fibers in the 12 layers of felt wall began absorbing water vapor directly from the air. This process of absorption is chemically exothermic. It releases latent heat. As the wool molecules bound with the water vapor molecules, the reaction released thermal energy directly into the matrix of the wall. Scientific measurements have confirmed that 1 kilogram of dry wool, upon absorbing moisture in a cold environment, can release up to 100 watts of thermal energy for several consecutive hours. Jargal's ger was wrapped in nearly 400 kilograms of felt. The walls themselves were actively generating hundreds of watts of passive heat, powered entirely by the simple act of human respiration and cooking steam. The second secret was the central heat source and its self-regulating chimney draft. In the exact geometric center of the ger floor sat a simple, low-profile sheet metal burner. It contained no high-tech fans or electric blowers, yet it burned with absolute, steady perfection. The fuel inside was compressed dung blocks Jargal. Unlike wood, which burns with tall, wild flames that race up a chimney and waste energy, Dried dung blocks burn with a low, intense, smoldering bed of glowing red coals. The dung released its energy slowly and evenly, creating a steady thermal output that did not spike or crash. The combustion was driven by an incredible natural physics phenomenon known as the stack draft. The central stovepipe extended straight up through the exact center of the crown ring, the tonneau at the peak of the ceiling. The massive temperature differential between the 700-degree combustion chamber inside the burner and the -52-degree air directly above the roof created a powerful, natural pressure gradient. Cold, dense air was drawn gently inward through tiny, controlled gaps at the base of the south-facing door, passing across the floor level where it was preheated by the warm gravel base before reaching the stove intake. The fire fed itself. If the temperature outside dropped even lower, the pressure differential increased, drawing slightly more oxygen into the fire and automatically increasing the heat output of the burner without anyone needing to adjust a damper. The system was completely self-regulating, powered entirely by the temperature difference between the hearth and the sky. The third secret was the circular convection loop created by the gers geometry. Because the ger has no flat ceiling and no right-angled corners, the warm air rising from the central burner did not get trapped overhead. It rose to the peak of the tonneau, struck the smooth, curved slope of the conical roof, and rolled gracefully down the curved lattice walls in a continuous, gentle, convective loop. The warm air moved down the walls, crossed the floor toward the center, and was drawn back up into the firebox. There were no stagnant cold corners. There were no freezing floor drafts. Every square inch of the interior perimeter, including the raised wooden sleeping platforms where Jargal's grandchildren lay sleeping under light wool blankets, received the exact same, continuous, soothing circulation of warm, dry air. Outside, the worst Arctic blizzard in 50 years was screaming across a frozen wilderness, tearing timber buildings apart and freezing livestock in their tracks. Inside old Jargal's wool fortress, the air was warm, the light was soft, and the family slept through the night in complete, unbroken peace. On the morning of January 14th, after 6 relentless days and nights, the great storm finally broke. The clouds cleared away, leaving behind a sky of blinding, brilliant, ice crystal blue. But the clear sky brought no warmth. The sun hung low and pale in the south, casting long thin blue shadows across a landscape that had been transformed into a silent Arctic desert. The steppe was buried beneath 5 feet of drifted, wind-packed snow. In the low valleys, the snow had formed massive crusts, so hard that a horse could walk across the top without breaking through, while beneath that crust lay the deadly, impenetrable layer of sheet ice that locked away the grass. At the district collective station, the situation was grim. The state-built wooden barracks were standing, but they were battered, frosted, and silent. 30 families were crammed into 2 rooms that had been saved by burning the interior framing of the other units. More than 40% of the collective's livestock lay dead in the wooden sheds, buried under snowdrifts that had blown straight through the cracked wall planks. Inspector Victor was in a state of shock. His pride, his official training, and his unshakable belief in modern industrial progress had been shattered over 6 horrific days. He had watched the timber barracks fail every single structural and thermal test. He had seen families suffer from hypothermia inside buildings that had cost thousands of rubles to construct. Through his exhaustion and trauma, one thought kept burning in his mind: old Jargal. Victor was convinced that the old herder and his family were dead. No human being could have survived 6 days of -52 degrees in a felt tent sitting on the open plain. He felt a heavy, crushing weight of guilt in his chest. He had threatened the old man, he had mocked his ancient ways, and now, Victor believed, he would find 4 frozen bodies buried beneath a collapsed pile of wool and willow poles. Using the district's last remaining team of heavy draft horses, Victor and 2 assistant officers set out across the frozen wasteland on a heavy wooden sledge, forging a path toward Jargal's winter camp. The 3-hour journey through the white silence was agonizing. Every kilometer they traveled revealed fresh evidence of the storm's devastation. They passed frozen carcasses of wild gazelles locked in the ice, They passed abandoned equipment half buried in drifts. The cold was so intense that the horses' nostrils were coated in thick cones of ice, and the wooden runners of the sledge creaked and groaned against the frozen snow like iron chains. Finally, the sledge crested the top of the southern ridge that overlooked Jargal's camp. Victor pulled the horses to a stop, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes searching the white basin below. He pulled his heavy binoculars from his coat pocket with numb, gloved fingers and raised them to his eyes. He froze. There, nestled in the gentle, south-facing bowl of the hillside slope, sat old Jargal's camp. The 4 gers of the core compound were not collapsed. They were not damaged. They stood perfectly intact, their smooth, curved shapes having shed the wind and snow so efficiently that the massive drifts had simply slid around them, piling up along the windward outer perimeter like a natural protective rampart. And from the central crown ring of the main ger, rising straight into the crisp, clear blue sky, was a thin, steady, beautiful plume of gray smoke. Victor stumbled down the slope, leaving his assistants behind, his boots breaking through the snow crust as he ran toward the camp. As he reached the central courtyard of the compound, he stopped dead in his tracks. The sight before him made no sense, according to any textbook he had ever read. Inside the sheltered inner courtyard, protected from the wind by the ring of 4 gers, sat more than 100 sheep and goats. They were standing calmly, chewing their cud, their wool coats dry and clean. Standing near the low wooden door of the main ger was Naren, carrying a wooden bucket of fresh water drawn from the river ice. She looked up, saw the frozen, exhausted inspector, and offered him a calm, warm smile. "He is inside, Inspector," she said softly, gesturing toward the door. "He has been waiting for you." Victor approached the low, southern door of the main ger. He unlatched the heavy felt flap, bowed his head to clear the low wooden frame, and stepped inside. The physical impact of entering that room was something Victor would remember for the rest of his life. Step from -52 degrees Celsius into an interior environment that registered a steady, warm 18 degrees Celsius, 64 degrees Fahrenheit, is a sensation that borders on the miraculous. The wall of warm, dry air hit Victor's frozen face like a physical touch. His frozen eyelashes began to thaw instantly, water droplets pooling on his cheeks. His numb hands began to tingle as the circulation rushed back into his fingers. The interior of the ger was clean, bright, and silent. The air smelled rich and comforting, a mixture of dried pine, warm wool, and the subtle, sweet aroma of smoldering dung blocks. Sitting on a low wooden stool near the central burner was old Jargal, wearing a light wool robe, pouring hot, salted milk tea from a copper kettle into a wooden bowl. Nestled in a small, felt-lined basket right next to the low wooden door were 3 newborn lambs that had been born during the height of the blizzard, sleeping peacefully in the radiant warmth. Jargal looked up from his tea, his dark eyes twinkling with a quiet, gentle humor. "You brought your thermometer, Inspector?" the old man asked softly. Victor did not speak. His hands trembling from a combination of cold and overwhelming emotion, he reached into his heavy overcoat pocket and pulled out his official brass-cased laboratory thermometer. He held it up in the center of the room, 30 centimeters above the floor level, and watched the red mercury column rise. It rose past 0. It rose past 10 degrees Celsius. It settled precisely at 18.5 degrees Celsius, or 65.3 degrees Fahrenheit. The numbers recorded in the audit were undeniable. With an exterior air temperature of -52 degrees Celsius, the state timber barracks registered -8 degrees inside, leaving water frozen solid and walls coated in ice. In contrast, Jargal's felt ger maintained a steady, warm 18.5 degrees Celsius, achieving a net temperature differential of over 70 degrees Celsius. Where the timber barracks burned 95 pounds of wood per day until fuel was completely exhausted, Jargal's home consumed only 22 pounds of compressed dung per day, with 85% of its supply remaining. The collective suffered over 38% livestock mortality, while Jargal's herd suffered 0 losses. Victor stared at the numbers he had just recorded. The data was indisputable. Old Jargal's wool tent, heated by dried animal dung, had maintained a temperature differential of 70 degrees Celsius above the exterior storm temperature. It had consumed less than one-fourth the fuel weight of the timber barracks. It had suffered zero livestock mortality. And it had accomplished all of this without cutting down a single tree, without using a single iron nail, and without burning a single piece of firewood. Victor looked up from his clipboard, his eyes meeting the old master herder's gaze. "I spent 4 years at the agricultural university," Victor said, his voice breaking with genuine humility. "They taught me architectural engineering. They taught me modern forestry. They taught me that traditional knowledge was backward, primitive, and weak. They were wrong, Jargal. Everything my textbooks taught me was wrong." Old Jargal handed the young inspector a steaming bowl of hot milk tea, his rough, dark hand resting gently on the young man's shoulder. "Your books are not wrong, young Victor," Jargal said gently. "Your books simply forgot that the earth has been teaching us how to live here for 3,000 years. You tried to fight the wind with straight boards and iron nails. We do not fight the wind. We ride it. We breathe with it. We wrap ourselves in the wool of our animals, and we let the sun and the earth do the work for us." Inspector Victor did not confiscate old Jargal's herd. Instead, he stayed at the winter camp for 3 days, sitting beside the old herder's central burner, filling 3 entire notebooks with detailed hand-drawn diagrams of the gers' structural frame, the scissor lattice geometry, the camel-hide joint ties, and the micro-topographic site selection principles. When Victor returned to the district center, he filed an official report that shocked the regional ministry in Ulaanbaatar. He recommended the immediate suspension of the timber barracks construction program across the entire northern sector. Instead, he proposed establishing regional felt crafting cooperatives and teaching young agricultural officers the traditional methods of manufacturing dense, multi-layered winter gers and harvesting compressed dung fuel blocks. Within 2 weeks, Victor returned to Jargal's camp, bringing with him 12 young herders and 2 state builders from the failing collective settlement. Old Jargal welcomed them into his camp without a word of judgment or pride. Over the remaining weeks of winter, the old master herder taught the young men how to build proper dung-burning stoves, how to arrange their shelters in the wind-blocking core circle formation, and how to harness the biological warmth of their livestock to survive the remaining cold months. When the warm spring winds finally returned in late April, melting the ice and covering the vast plateau in a carpet of brilliant green grass, old Jargal's family prepared for their annual spring migration. In less than 45 minutes, the forgers of the winter camp were completely dismantled. The 12 layers of felt were rolled tightly and lashed to pack frames. The willow roof poles were bundled together. The lattice wall sections were collapsed into compact flat grids. Everything the family owned was loaded onto the backs of 3 strong pack camels. Old Jargal mounted his horse and looked back at the site where his family had lived through the deadliest winter in 50 years. There was no trash left behind. There were no cracked concrete slabs. There were no rotted timber frames or rusty iron nails sticking out of the mud. There was only a circle of flattened, dark grass where the ger had stood a mark that would vanish entirely after the first summer rain, leaving no scar upon the face of the plateau. If you enjoyed this journey into the incredible survival wisdom of the past, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories every week, and drop a comment below sharing what lesson from old Jargal's story resonated with you the most. Stay warm, stay curious, and thank you for watching.